What you're about to hear was never meant for public ears, and once it's heard, it can't be unheard. Because in this dramatized account, Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, suggests that Meghan Markle's past contains a chapter that was never intended to surface. Not a chapter that begins with Prince Harry or palace gates, but one that starts out at sea, far from cameras, far from schedules, far from anything that can be easily confirmed. And this is where the story shifts from rumor to something far more explosive in tone. Sarah Ferguson doesn't merely hint at suspicion in this version. She frames it as something she believes she can support with materials, items that exist regardless of anyone's opinion. She suggests there are private documents, letters never meant to be read by outsiders, and recordings never meant to be heard beyond the moment they were made. Pieces of a past that, according to her, weren't erased, only stored. She claims Meghan wasn't simply near Andrew's world. She says Meghan had a role inside it. And she uses a phrase that changes the entire mood of the story: his first client. It's an unsettling choice of words, not because it proves anything by itself, but because it implies something structured. A client isn't someone who wanders into a scene accidentally. A client suggests an arrangement, a relationship defined by expectation, a transaction of some kind, even if the details were never spoken out loud. That language is the kind that doesn't sound romantic or coincidental. It sounds deliberate. And the moment Sarah uses it, the fairy tale framing of Meghan's rise, the accidental meeting, the destiny, the innocence of timing, begins to wobble. Because if Meghan's early proximity to Andrew is recast as purposeful, then the starting point of the public story shifts. It no longer begins with Harry. It begins with access. In this retelling, Sarah is not painting a casual social encounter. She describes a world where invitations don't float around casually. They are delivered through intermediaries, people whose names never appear on official itineraries, people who specialize in placing the right person in the right room and making sure no one asks how they arrived. According to Sarah, Meghan's presence around Andrew wasn't a one-time coincidence. It was repeated, familiar, and increasingly difficult to dismiss as chance. And this is where the story gets sharper, because Sarah argues that the language "first client" also implies something else, a pattern that could have begun early, not just for Andrew, but for Meghan. A pattern where proximity becomes opportunity, where intimacy and access overlap, where doors open not because they're unlocked, but because someone wants them opened. For Harry, this would be the most destabilizing part, not the scandal itself, but the collision of worlds. Harry has spent years publicly separating himself from Andrew, distancing himself from everything Andrew's name now represents, drawing moral lines, making statements, signaling disgust. So imagine what that phrase would do if it landed inside Harry's life like a stone. Because it doesn't just suggest Meghan knew Andrew, it suggests she belonged to the orbit Harry spent his adult life rejecting. And if that possibility exists, even as a shadow, it rearranges everything Harry thinks he knows about his own story. In Sarah's framing, what makes the situation truly dangerous is not her opinion, it's the idea of proof. She claims she came across correspondence, private messages, handwritten notes, personal exchanges that supposedly connected Meghan back to that time. Not formal letters with polite distance, but familiar writing that suggests shared memory, private jokes, specific references, small details that sound ordinary until you realize only certain people would recognize them. She presents these alleged letters as the kind of evidence that can't be argued with emotionally. Paper doesn't need to persuade, it simply exists. And once paper exists, the debate shifts. It's no longer who believes what, it becomes who can deny what's physically present. Still, even documents can be disputed, ink can be questioned, context can be argued. People can claim forgery, misunderstanding, coincidence. But sound is different. And this is where Sarah's story crosses into its most dramatic territory. Because in this dramatized retelling, she claims there are recordings, not descriptions, not recollections, actual preserved audio, the kind of material that carries tone, rhythm, personality, familiarity, the kind of evidence that can't be easily separated from the person speaking. Sarah describes these recordings as conversations from the Yacht era, private exchanges that, if ever made public, would be instantly recognizable. Because a voice doesn't just communicate words, it communicates closeness, comfort, unfiltered familiarity. And that's what makes this story feel like a point of no return. If Harry were to hear his wife's voice in a private conversation with the uncle he despised, it wouldn't just be information. It would be reality rearranging itself. The past would stop being theoretical. It would become audible. In Sarah's telling, that is the real power of recordings. They don't argue, they don't persuade, they play. And once played, the story becomes something the listener can't escape. At this stage of the narrative, the emotional fallout is focused on Harry. Because Harry built a public identity around protection, defending Meghan, framing her as the one harmed by the institution, positioning himself as her shield. He didn't just love her privately, he fought publicly for her. And shields crack when they're built on stories that aren't complete. In this version, Sarah implies Harry's response wasn't immediate acceptance. It was oscillation, anger, disbelief, denial, demands for explanation, then retreat. Because accepting the possibility would force Harry to confront something worse than betrayal. It would force him to consider that he may not have been the beginning of Meghan's royal story at all, only the final chapter. Inside the royal world, silence is never random. It isn't simply no comment. It's strategy. When a story is dangerous enough, institutions don't rush to deny it. They weigh the cost of every word. In this dramatized narrative, Sarah suggests that when these claims began circulating privately, the response wasn't loud rebuttal. It was closed-door meetings, quiet phone calls, conversations that never produced public statements. Because the palace would understand what was at stake. Andrew's controversies already bruised the monarchy. To link Meghan, a woman who challenged the institution publicly, to Andrew's private orbit would create a catastrophic overlap. Not just embarrassing, but structurally damaging. It would tie multiple uncomfortable chapters together into one continuous story. And so the instinct wouldn't be confrontation, it would be containment. Sarah frames it like this. Acknowledging the claim risks validating it. Denying the claim risks provoking proof. And proof, she insists, exists in forms that would be difficult to control once released. That is why fear replaces confidence in this telling. Not fear of headlines, but fear of what else surfaces if the thread is pulled. Sarah claims she stayed quiet for years, not because she lacked the story, but because she understood the consequences. In royal circles, speaking isn't just a personal decision. It impacts families, titles, reputations, and institutions. But in this retelling, she reaches a point where she no longer wants to carry it alone. And she makes a sharper claim. Meghan's presence on Andrew's yachts wasn't accidental. It wasn't a single occurrence. It was repeated. Familiar, part of a world Meghan understood long before she became a duchess. If true, even partially, it doesn't add a minor footnote. It forces a rewrite of the origin story. Because it would suggest Meghan's proximity to royal shadows began before she ever met Harry, before the public even knew her name. It would suggest she had already navigated environments where privacy is engineered, where accountability is softened by distance, where powerful people feel untouchable because the sea itself hides them. And that brings us back to the yacht, the setting Sarah keeps emphasizing. In this story, the yacht isn't simply a backdrop, it's the mechanism. a floating world built for one overriding purpose: privacy. Out at sea, the usual rules weaken, titles blur, boundaries soften. People behave differently when they believe they're beyond witnesses. These aren't casual day trips, Sarah claims. They're controlled retreats, curated guest lists, quiet rules, a culture where discretion is currency. Champagne flows, conversations loosen, relationships form away from public eyes. And because there are no cameras, no reporters, no public schedule, people assume nothing can follow them back to shore. Sarah argues Meghan wasn't a stranger to that environment, not someone who stumbled into it once, someone who returned, someone who became familiar, someone who understood how the floating world operated, who to speak to, how to blend in, how to be invited again. This is why Sarah insists the yacht matters. It explains how proximity was possible, how repetition could happen quietly, how a future duchess could exist inside royal shadows before the public ever connected the dots. And it is why that phrase returns again, the phrase that tilts the entire narrative: his first client. In Sarah's framing, that phrase isn't chosen for shock alone. It's chosen because it suggests intent, arrangement, structure, a relationship defined by something more than social coincidence. And once you place intent at the start of the timeline, the entire public story changes. What the world has been told becomes one version: polished, presentable, safe. But Sarah suggests there's another version, one built on materials still unreleased, letters that remain unseen, audio that remains unheard, evidence that sits somewhere preserved because it lacks power, but because it carries too much. The most unsettling part of this story isn't what has been publicly said, it's what hasn't been shown. Somewhere, Sarah implies, the past exists in physical form, not just memory, but objects, pages, files, recordings, items that don't care who denies them. And that's why she frames her upcoming tell-all as a threat, not a memoir. Because once proof enters the public sphere, institutions lose control of the narrative, and control, in royal life, is everything. Prince Harry believed he escaped the past when he left the palace, but the past doesn't respect distance. It waits, it reappears, and sometimes it returns in the worst way, by connecting names you never expected to hear spoken together. Sarah's closing implication is simple and chilling. Whether or not the materials are ever released, the possibility alone is enough to destabilize trust because it introduces uncertainty at the foundation of the story, the beginning. And if the beginning is uncertain, everything built on it starts to shake. If the yacht could speak, if those quiet cabins and polished decks could tell their history, Sarah suggests the public wouldn't be hearing the end of the story, they'd be hearing the start. Because some ghosts don't vanish when you walk away. They follow.